Okay, so this is our second session on the origins of government, and hopefully the uploads will be more cooperative. One of the first things we did for those of you at home is a series of questions to warm up. I'm going to email those to you. You should look at those first. You should answer those independently before you continue the video. Just to highlight some of them. Let's kind of speed to the two-way, yesterday we started with the definition of government in general. And the physical framework in which government works, a state. And you should obviously be able to define both terms along with all of the important terms that are embedded in there. As we defined up government in general, we moved on to the more specific. So what I gave you guys yesterday was a classification system, a way to think about the different types of government by thinking about the location of power. It seems like a cryptic question at first, but what am I really saying? What are my two questions? I have power, and I can think about the location of that power. What are my two questions?
Who has the power and where is the
Good.
power?
Who? Again, think of my conveniently square state. And I have in this conveniently square state different individuals that can claim power, I suppose. So I'm looking at who holds power, and then I'm looking at within that conveniently square state, where does it reside geographically? All right? So using that first question of who holds power, what were my three general types of government where I can talk about who holds power? I had three big kind of classification systems. Jen?
Autocracy, oligarchy, and democracy.
Good. Autocracies, oligarchies, and democracies. And autocracy, as I define it, what is it? Who holds power? Auto.
One person.
One person. Oligarchies. Who holds power? Jenny. A few people. Democracies. Who holds power? Leo.
Many people.
Many people, okay? So it goes from one to a few to many. And with each of these, today in our warm-up we just did kind of one example. With each of these, hopefully you can do multiple examples. Like what's an example of an autocracy? Go ahead.
A dictatorship?
Yeah, a dictatorship. We could have talked about absolute monarchs. We could have talked about constitutional monarchs. A dictatorship is a third kind. And you should be able to distinguish between the three. What makes each different, right? Just as a kind of another question I throw at you, what's the difference between dictatorship, totalitarianism, and fascism? Can anybody do that today, if I put you on the spot? What do you think, Jenny?
Dictatorship is when one person takes over by force.
Good.
Totalitarianism is when the leader tries to control all aspects of the social, political, and economic.
Excellent.
And then fascism is like the idea that the state and the needs of the state are more important than the needs of the people.
Good. So, as you said, the dictatorship is where a single individual is holding power, and they got that power by fear, force, intimidation. And again, if you were writing about this, you'd illustrate what we mean by fear, force, and illustration. The totalitarian system or approach to ruling is where you try to control every aspect of society. And again, if you were writing about this, you'd have examples. We went through a bunch yesterday about everything from Hitler's use of the radio to the Hitler Youth Program, and you'd do descriptions of this, the Autobahn, on and on it goes. Fascism is the ideology. It's what the rationale for doing a lot of this. It's because of a deep-seated belief that the needs of the individual are secondary to the needs of the state. It's almost mythologically based. It's what in part distinguishes it from communism, because both are about the collective good. But with communism, there's this, I suppose, kind of logic, rational-based approach. Whereas with fascism, it's, again, almost mythologically based, that you're a people of destiny. And great things are going to happen if we act together collectively. All right? So those are all examples of autocracies. How about an oligarchy? What example did you have for an oligarchy? There were two specific ones I gave you, but there's lots of ways to classify.
Theocracy.
I would say it again?
Theocracy.
A theocracy. And who's in charge in that case?
A religious,
Good. Religious officials, right? They're elite because they have religious authority. Remember a second one? It's fun to say. What is it, Liam? A junta. See, I told you it'd be fun to say. And who's in charge of that?
Like a military force.
Good. Military forces. Lots of ways to kind of create oligarchies And again, you just kind of change the thing that makes them elite, and often there's a term that goes with it. The easiest, perhaps, is looking at the democracies, right? We know the examples of that one, hopefully backwards and forwards. What are the two obvious examples of democracies? The two different ways to kind of classify a democratic system. Every hand goes out, because this is what you signed up for, right? All right. Go ahead.
Indirect.
Yeah, indirect and direct, okay? And one of the things I asked you is to kind of compare, contrast them, to do kind of pros and cons. Obviously, there's a distinction as to what do we do with power in an indirect democracy? What was that important concept? We transfer it. So that's the obvious distinction. One is where you make decisions directly. The other is where we've transferred powers. The implication is, again, we can take it back, right? But we've transferred power. Pros and cons. What's the advantage to us holding on to power? What do we like about direct democracies? What do you like about them, Liam?
Everyone's voices are...
Yeah, we like that. That's a value in itself. We feel like it's best when everyone has a say in something, and an equal say. We all become kind of screaming 5-year-olds when we think something's not fair. That hits some sort of primal hotspot where we just don't like it. We like things to be fair. We like to have a say in things. And therefore we kind of hold the direct democracy in high esteem. How did the founding fathers look at it? How did the framers look at direct democracy? What do they equate it to? Nick?
Like rule by the mob.
Yeah, they looked at it as mob rule, that we're easily swayed by demagogues, that we can be duped. So what's the advantages to indirect democracy? If it's not mob rule, what is it?
So you transfer the power to professionals?
Yeah, we've given it to professionals who have expertise and knowledge that we don't have, and time that we don't have, and a staff that we don't have. The other major kind of pro and con is think about where direct democracies exist to where they couldn't exist. Go ahead.
Direct democracies only work with small populations.
Right, so when you get to a larger situation, it's not efficient, right? It only works in small groups. So what's helpful is often when you're doing this kind of exercise, and you're going to see this throughout the year, if you think about the pros kind of for a direct democracy, they're going to turn out to be the cons for an indirect. And conversely, the pros for an indirect democracy are the cons for a direct. So you can often just kind of flip-flop your logic and come up with kind of more information. Now, where you guys indicated you struggled a little bit is we can argue that an indirect democracy is a democracy, and power is simply transferred, and it's ours to take back. But this is not just a course on theory. This is not just a course on how things ought to work on paper. We're going to look at how things work in reality. And in reality, there are all kinds of signs that would indicate we don't have as much say as we would think. Political scientists have come up with kind of 3 theories that talk about who really holds power in an indirect democracy, or what happens to power. Can you remember them just in general? Nick?
Power, elite, bureaucracy, and journalism.
Good. So these are ones we'll come back to time and time again. The first one is the power elite, as Nick said. The name gives it away. That's the other beautiful thing about my subject area, is if you don't know something, half the time all you got to do is, you speak English, the term is in English, break the term down and you'll know what we're talking about. Who's in charge according to the power elite theory? Brian, who's in charge?
The elite.
The elite. There you go. Beautiful. He didn't even raise his hand, but he knew it. I knew I could zero in on him. The elite are in charge. The tricky part would then be listing the elite. Who are we talking about really here? And we're talking about leaders of corporations. We're talking about labor leaders. They have a lot of power, and they're the kind of the counterbalance. We'd be talking about media moguls. I don't know if you know Ted Turner. I don't know if you know Rupert Murdoch. There are these big kind of powerful figures who control a conglomeration of media outlets. So you'll get to know those kind of figures. I don't know if you know you'd probably know Warren Buffett. He'd be a big time, figure that you'd be aware of as one of the wealthiest individuals out there, but an example of a corporate leader who definitely has sway. What's interesting with him is he's talking about adjusting the tax structure. He talks about the wealthy not paying the same percentage as lower income people, because wealthy individuals get a lot of their wealth from investments, and we tax investments differently than we do income. So he talks about how his people ought to be taxing him more based on his investments and the wealth he gets from it. He says that he makes his tax the rate is lower than his secretary. He says this publicly, and the media picks up on it, and it helps maybe to influence public policy. There were figures, I guess, is what I'm trying to hint at. Like I said, the Warren Buffetts, like the Jack Walshes, like the Rupert Murdochs, that this elite theory is suggesting actually kind of, work behind the scenes and pull strings. According to bureaucratic theory, it was language I tried to, sear into your head here. Let's start with this. What's a bureaucracy? What's happening here?
Specialized people with specialized tasks.
Good. It's where specialized workers do specialized tasks, and therefore, ideally, when you specialize, what's the logic to a bureaucracy?
Yeah, like becomes more efficient.
Yeah. So I've taken the job of government and I've divided it. Divide and conquer, right? And I've given it to these departments, agencies, where I would expect as they specialize, they get better and we get greater efficiency. Give me an example of a bureaucracy, an institution.
DMV.
Yeah, the Department of Motor Vehicles. You'd certainly know that on the local level. Give me one on the federal level. A department and agency. We looked at some yesterday. Do you remember from like the cabinet maybe?
IRS.
Yeah, the Internal Revenue Service. They specialize in collecting money, collecting tax revenue, and they get really good at it. To a lot of people's chagrin. How about one from my cabinet, from my executive branch? Do you remember the departments?
The USDA.
Yeah. So we're looking at the United States Department of Agriculture. And they're going to specialize in food production and all of the things that should govern food production and distribution and sales and consumption. Okay? So ideally, they're getting better. Now, here's the language that we really wanted to practice. What according to the theory, actually happens with bureaucracies? They don't get it more efficient. What do? You had this experience, I kind of hinted at it with like the DMV. It's supposed to be this streamlined, easy kind of process, and then I asked you guys if it was pleasant for you. And almost universally you said no. Okay, this happens every year. It's funny, it's hard to stick. So again, you may want to look at it in your notes and circle, circle, circle. They create procedures, coming back to you, and protocols. And maybe it's just the language there. Procedure is step A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And ideally they're doing it because it's more efficient. But what ends up happening is you're a rat running through a maze to get anything done. Whenever you study something intensively, what you ultimately do is kind of complicate it. We do it with education all the time. We're constantly looking at how to educate people better. And we begin to talk about, you need to have a clear objective up front. And then you need to have enduring understandings that come from that. And you should clearly communicate that to the kids in terms of writing. And then once you've made your objective clear, you should have a way to measure and assess whether kids have done that. And that should be done using a rubric. And the rubric should be clear and transparent to kids. And it should have gradations of quantity and quality. And so I spend the first 40 minutes in class explaining this all to you. And you're hearing Charlie Brown's teacher, correct? Here's my objective, here's my enduring understanding, here's what we're going to do at the end of class, here's how I'm going to evaluate you. And you're like, what is it we're doing here today? All right? I've created procedures supposedly to be more effective, and what I've done in the process is I've strangled the process, right? Procedures and protocols. Protocol means you've got to kind of have this person sign off on it. There's a way to do this in order in a sequence. Okay? So that's the bureaucratic theory. It suggests that any kind of, we think we're in charge, but the bureaucracies are in charge, and what the bureaucracies are doing is kind of killing any kind of change or reform. Bureaucracies, by definition, want to grow, want to maintain. I'm my own example of a mini bureaucracy. I'm a department chair. I have a staff, I have a budget that I get some discretion over, okay? Do you think there's any year where I say I need less staff and less money? I might not need the same amount of people one year, the same amount of money, but if I say I don't need them, then my department and my job security is declining as opposed to growing. So every year, if I asked for $4,000 last year, I'm going to ask for $4,500 this year, and I'll likely get $2,000. And then I'm going to spend it to the penny to show that, yes, I needed that money. Bureaucracies have a way of kind of not looking at big picture. They want job security, they want growth, and they tend to create procedures and protocols to demonstrate their value and worth, and it strangles the process, according to the theory. Now, the third theory was considered the most important in many ways, because it pops up in all kinds of places. It's called the pluralist theory. Does anybody remember how that works? Go ahead, Jack.
There's like so many big powers and interest groups that they just cancel.
They cancel each other out, right? What would be an example that I gave you yesterday? Give me two groups that kind of are counter and then they cancel.
The oil companies and then like environmental groups.
Yeah. So, people would say that, these corporate elites are in charge and these, labor groups are pulling us in this other direction. And then they forget, well, aren't those kind of two entities at opposite kind of extremes? And might they cancel each other? The pluralist theory says that, essentially there's a democratic form, everybody kind of, has access to that democratic form, they all kind of have their say, and ultimately they kind of, not necessarily negate they do negate or cancel each other in that we reach some sort of middle or medium ground, okay? So that's the pluralist theory. Now, all of those systems were about who holds power. The second classification system we didn't get to is where is power geographically. Enough of people at home are getting sick. They can't even see the board anyways. So where is power geographically? And again, I have three ways to kind of talk about where power is geographically. And it goes from, I guess, kind of a simple, concentrated kind of form of where power is geographically to a more diffused. It kind of parallels with our who holds power. So I'm going to take a pause. Technical, who was that? A random child. We should get that on camera. Sorry for those at home. All right. So we're going to talk about the three places that power can be geographically. We've got a unitary, a confederate kind of model, and a federal system. And obviously, I think the last two ought to be quite familiar to you. I try to drill this into your head as ninth graders, that in order for you to graduate, you had to show a certain amount of political, cultural literacy. And everybody ought to be able to tell us that we're an indirect democracy or a representative democracy, or more specifically, a republic. Remember what distinguishes that. And then we had to talk about who holds power, and we're obviously a federal system. There's two ways to define us politically. One is who holds power, the other is where is power geographically. To cascade through these, let's start with the unitary. Uni, again, one. What it implies is that power is centralized. In this system, you simply have a central government, logically kind of located perhaps in the capital, and they have universal authority over all their political subdivisions. So you may have a country, you may have multiple provinces, districts, states, towns, whatever you want to call it, but they all are under the authority of a single central government. Typically what a test wants you to do is not only identify, it wants you to identify and analyze. So what it might look at is, what are the pros and cons to this? Well, with a unitary system, you have one government, you have kind of uniform policies and laws. It standardizes things, and sometimes that can be a good thing. It raises everybody to the same level. you know, let's say the unitary government has a universal standard with, you know, we talked yesterday about emission standards, and you know, we talked about public policy, that's the cumulative efforts to address a particular issue or problem. We talked about environmental concerns, and we talked about adolescent obesity. In our system, different states have different approaches. And the federal government kind of sets a bar that's kind of the minimum, and, you know, with regards to its policy. And states are free to go above it, but they can't drop, say, below it. And it creates kind of a different approach to, let's say, environmental, you know, laws. With the unitary system, they'd say, no, everyone's going to follow this standard. They can set the standard as high as they want with regards to, let's say, the environment. Let's say, with regards to nutritional standards. Let's say, with regards to gun control. Here is the universal standard, and everyone will kind of follow it. The problem with that is, you know, if you're only given one option, sure, it may raise everybody up, but it may also be a recipe for tension, for you know, turmoil, because you're not meeting local needs. You know, I mentioned gun control kind of off the cuff. Well, different parts of the country have different kind of lifestyles that mean the approach to gun control is different. You know, if you live in a rural area where hunting and sport, you know, outdoor kind of sport is more common and part of your tradition, you may take a different approach to gun control than someone living in, say, the suburbs, like we do, where you're like, what is the need for that? You might have a different approach based on different locations. So the unitary system is good in that there's uniform, consistent policies. However, I take the pro and I flip it on its head. The other side of the coin is, if it's uniform, it means it can't meet diverse needs of diverse people. Okay? We go to the Confederate model. You obviously kind of know what that is because you've studied Confederate models in various classes, in your history classes, right? I can take you all the way back to the Holy Roman Empire, which was a confederacy. Or we can look at the US experience and obviously look at our own version of a confederacy, and there's two different points. You all were immediately fast forwarding to the Civil War, right? And the Southern Confederacy, but which one did you forget? Under the Articles of Confederation, we were a confederacy. Under our first form of government after the Revolution, we were a confederacy. So use those kind of historic moments to understand what it is. I've got a collection of states that are very wary of giving up power to a central government. In the Holy Roman Empire, the Germanic states were fiercely independent. And they fought the power of the Holy Roman Empire, or emperor, tooth and nail. After the Revolutionary War, it's an incredibly flawed system of confederacy, but it was probably the only way and direction we could go in, because we had just gotten out from underneath what we saw as an oppressive central government. Why would we go back to one, right? So basically we wanted to keep all the power in the states and under that model. Same thing with the Southern Confederacy during the Civil War. There's economic issues, there's the issue of slavery that's interrelated, and the states want autonomy on those issues. Okay? So in a confederacy, you've got a group of states, but they want to maintain as much power as they want. But they want some of the benefits of that collective power that, you know, remember we talked about Ben Franklin suggesting a confederacy in the Albany Convention. And we talked about how Chief Conesago was invited there to talk about the Iroquois Confederacy, and he did that demonstration with the arrows, that there's strength in numbers when you kind of come together collectively. So what they try to do is achieve this kind of medium, where we're together, but we're together in an alliance. Notice I've got that word bolded and underlined. It's probably the easiest way to understand a confederacy. We're in an alliance, and an alliance suggests autonomy, I guess. You know, that we're together because it works and because it fits. But I haven't given up my independence in an alliance. You know, I'm not subservient to anybody in an alliance. We're all kind of co-equals working together. Typically what we're allied for is issues of like trade. That's something that we can agree on. We want to encourage exportation of goods and cut down on the importation of goods. We can agree on issues of maybe development of national infrastructure, maybe, depending on who's funding it. Yes, we want national roadways, but I don't want to fund it. We can agree on defense. You know, that we need to kind of work together collectively for defense, but again, I don't want to fund it. And that I'm hinting at is the weakness of a confederacy. Historically, they're unstable. We want the benefits of working together collectively, but we often don't want to pay for those benefits. And because people can't be forced into doing anything, they historically become unraveled. We'll look at that more intensively later. All right, the one we really have to zero in on is the federal system. The distinction between it and a confederacy sometimes is a little tricky because it seems similar. I have a central government and I have subdivisions. And I have a power sharing arrangement in both cases. In a confederacy, the subdivisions, the states maintain most of their power and they give a little bit to the central government. Well, how's that different than a federal system? Because again, I've got subdivisions and a central government and power has been kind of divided up a little bit. Well, the division, first and foremost, is more governed by a constitution. The division is formalized, and it's essentially set in stone. You want to change the power-sharing arrangement, you have to change the Constitution. And a Constitution, typically, cannot be changed unilaterally. States can't decide, I'm simply going to change it. When we look at how you modify our Constitution, it's a multi-step process. The states first need, the central government first needs to kind of propose an amendment and ratify that proposal by a supermajority, and then the states weigh in on it, and they also have to come up with a supermajority to approve it. You can't easily change the Constitution. You know, historically, there's been over, I want to say 10,000. We'll come back later on and see if my number is right. I believe there's been over 10,000 amendments proposed. How many actually have been approved? How many amendments do we have? We've got at least 10, right? That's the Bill of Rights.
27.
Who said it? How many?
27.
27. Very good. We've got 27 amendments. So this is not something easily changed. And it means the power sharing arrangement is a little more stable. Now what's the other difference? Well, I've got a little bit more division. In our federal system, we have a federal government, a central government, located in Washington, D.C. We've got state governments, and we also have local governments. And so when you look at the federal system, I think one of the things that's interesting that defines it is, a way to think about it is you've got three different governments all having jurisdiction over you, right? Think about like with education. There's three levels of government that have influence and sway over your education, right? Start at the local level. Who hired me? Who pays me? Who comes up with a program of studies? You know, what courses we're going to offer. That's the local level. However, the state sets certain standards. What are the obvious standards it sets? You know this, you hate this. What does every, child in Massachusetts have to do? You've got to pass the MCAS. The state will set standards with regards to curriculum, and that influences our program of studies, obviously. It influences what I teach. I've got to constantly be aware of those standards and what the test looks like, and next is coming the PARC, right? That's another kind of standardized test that's coming. The state also influences through funding. How about the federal government? Is there any standards that the federal government sets that we have to follow? Is there a famous law that you might know about, or just kind of basic standards that they might set?
No child left behind.
Does that ring a bell? Do you guys recognize? That's where MCAS is a way of meeting the requirements of No Child Left Behind. What's unique about No Child Left Behind is they also talk about adequately yearly progress. That not only do you need to pass this test, but they're going to look at all the demographics that took that test and where they are. Where are boys and girls? Where are different people of different ethnic groups and religious groups and different learning populations? And what I want to see is, with all of those subsets, that they're making progress year to year. All right? So the federal government adds standards. Anti-discrimination statutes are also there from the federal government that we've got to meet. The federal government also has a lot to say about funding. So you've got three levels of government all having sway and jurisdiction over your education. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? We're going to talk, this section, when we get to it, we're going to go much, much more in depth. when we get to it, it initially seems like the most academic, the most dry and therefore mind-numbing section that we'll cover. But it actually, I think you'll have an epiphany. You'll realize it is not only the most interesting topic that we're going to cover, it's the most meaningful. Because this is going to be at the heart of how you eventually vote and participate politically. Because what we're talking about when we talk about the federal system is which level of government governs best. And that matters. You know, okay, come back to the environmental issue. Who's most equipped to handle that? Is it the federal government, or should it be left to the states and the localities because they know their local needs best? Do we need a universal standard that every state's going to rise to, or is that universal standard a minimum that puts an artificial ceiling on states, and we could do much better if it wasn't there? Think of the same issue with like education. Would we be better off if we're left alone on the local level? Or do we need the power of the federal government to raise schools across the United States to a certain level? It's a really important question. Which level of government governs best? To get into it, we'll eventually talk about these powers that you see in red. One of the things my course does is I layer. I've already deliberately started to embed concepts that we'll come back to 3 or 4 times because you need repetition. It's not like you're going to hear it once and you're going to get it. All right? So I mentioned in a federal system, what we do is we take power and we divide it between the federal, state, and local levels. Well, that division is rather formal. All right? And it's deliberate. So we're going to run through the 7 types of powers just kind of, this time, and I'll, ask you the next time if you can list, and then the next time we do it, I'll ask if you can list and define, and then the next time I'll ask if you can list, define, and illustrate, and the next time I'll ask, can you list, define, illustrate, and provide constitutional source? All right? And you'll get really good at this. When we think about power, the first thing we think about is where should it begin? And given our history and our wariness of King George and an abusive central government in England, we're wary of a central government. So we think about power starting with the states. And what they do is they hand off some of that power under this formalized division of power to the central government. All right? That's called the delegated powers. And of course they're going to have synonyms for all of these. We'll start working on the synonyms. That makes it even more complicated. So certain power is transferred or delegated to the federal government. So by definition, if it's not handed over, it stays with the states. It's a way we kind of prevent the concentration and therefore abuse of power. Remember, power corrupts. Do you remember that axiom? It's Lord Acton, member of Parliament. Power corrupts, absolute power. Can anybody end that? Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Coming back to you? See if it comes back to you this way. Remember in 9th grade, I gave you guys degrees of power. I gave you control of the classroom, theoretically, and then the school, and then the town. And the grins got bigger and bigger because initially you thought, okay, classroom, we're going to do our own kind of, lecture series here, Mr. Hastings, using technology, and it's going to be, I don't know, a version of Dancing with the Stars, and we're going to sing up here. We're going to do a little karaoke, right? And then, we can control the intercom system, and Nick's going to, you heard about bacon burgers yesterday. He's going to go down and fry up some bacon burgers for everybody. We begin to think about all the fun things we can do in the school with no higher authority, right? And then all of a sudden, it's the town, and it's like, okay, fire truck demolition derby. And you started thinking about the hose fights, and then you said, no, let's just smash these trucks together. And then you thought about, okay, the next biggest kind of form of power. Do you remember how I kind of walked you through that and I gave you ridiculous scenarios? The more power I gave you, the bigger the grins got. The grins got bigger because you were thinking of not the nice things you were going to do, a recycling initiative, Mr. Hastings. I can't wait to have power because we're going to go green. We're going to you've been talking a lot about the environment here today. We're really going to show you the kids know what to do. We're going to fix the environmental problem. No, you thought about the abuse you're going to do. So, long story short, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the whole magic formula that we try to do in our government is make sure we're cautious with power, that we divide it, that we then overlap powers so that you can't use them unilaterally. And you see that in our federal system. All right, coming back to it now. The states have the power because we don't want the central government to start with it. We're going to hand you something. That's called the delegated powers. The power, everything else by definition belongs to the states, and it means that the federal government can't assume powers it doesn't have. That's reserved. All right? However, it works great in theory, it doesn't work great in practice. How is a government supposed to function for contingencies that we haven't kind of planned on? You know, sometimes the language might handcuff it, and therefore we have implied powers. If you look in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, it's called the Necessary and Proper Clause, and it allows Congress to do anything necessary and proper to carry out its listed powers. Well, in the famous landmark Supreme Court case, McCulloch versus Maryland, we kind of went to that phrase and interpreted that. Anybody remember what triggered McCulloch versus Maryland? You're going to wake up sweating McCulloch versus Maryland. You're going to just scream it like you have night terrors at night. McCulloch versus Maryland and Marbury versus Madison will haunt you the entire year. What triggered it?
McCulloch versus Maryland. That was the state of Maryland trying to like subsidize federal banks.
The national bank. Good. The quick trigger is the national bank and Maryland's effort to tax that national bank. You know, the question, the initial constitutional question is, where in the Constitution does it say the federal government can create a national bank in the first place? There's no specific language for it. And then the secondary question is, can Maryland tax it? Well, again, in the condensed version of this case, the Supreme Court looked at that necessary and proper clause, which we nicknamed the elastic clause because it allows the government to stretch its powers, and says, you know, we have the power to borrow and coin money, that's a delegated power. We have the power to tax and spend, that's a delegated power. Those powers require a related power. You know, if you're going to borrow and coin money, you got to have a place to put it and a place to kind of regulate and track things. You can imply from the delegated power an implied power. Now, very important distinction. Notice I haven't said the implied power comes from nowhere. It has to be implied. It has to be derived from a delegated power. It has to have a logical source. The second thing the McCulloch versus Maryland did is they struck down Maryland's power to tax the national government. They considered the power to tax the power to destroy. And Maryland didn't have authority over the federal government because of the supremacy clause. All right? Moving on. Those are the three, you know, initial kind of powers that you can get through logic. I've got power in a central location, or not a central location, with the states. We transfer some, we hold on to the rest, and then the federal government can take its limited powers and imply some others. We also have shared powers. They're going to also refer to them as concurrent, where both levels of government can do certain things. Power to tax is a good example. Both the state government and the federal government can tax. Both have police powers. All right? Then there are certain ones that are off limit, denied or prohibited. Neither can violate certain standards when it comes to your freedom of speech, press, assembly. And then academics like to talk about things that are outside the box. All of these stem from constitutional powers. What about things that maybe aren't in the Constitution but are necessary? Things that aren't delegated nor could be implied. Well, they'd call them inherent powers. Governments sometimes can go beyond the scope of the Constitution to claim certain inherent powers. I'm doing this because I'm a government. It's essential to law, order, and stability. Hard to come up with an example because really you can almost, if you take a liberal approach, almost anything can be implied from the delegated powers. You know, let's talk about like mass inoculations. There's some sort of swine flu that's going around that is creating a public crisis, a health crisis, right? Can I inoculate people? People have reservations about inoculation. Maybe the government can claim it as an inherent power because I can't find it anywhere else. But I don't know. There's the phrase there's the general welfare clause that suggests the government is there to promote the general welfare. And I can maybe derive it from that. In sum, we're going to get more familiar with the federal system because of its kind of critical nature. The things that I'm stressing is it's a division of power between three levels of government as established by a constitution which cannot be unilaterally changed. Its pros are it has the best of both worlds. It can, like the unitary model, impose uniform standards. But, like the Confederacy, it can take a flexible approach. What's neat about the federal system is it can allow states to act as laboratories. Hey, we're trying to fix the educational system. let's see what the states are doing, and let's adopt it then on the national model, what's working. That was what happened with MCAS, essentially. That was what happened. Massachusetts, again, the universal health care law became kind of the model for Obamacare. All right? So the pros are I can be unilateral, or excuse me, uniform when I want to, or I can be flexible when I want to. The cons are it's confusing, and this overlap often creates tension, and we'll look at that more in depth. Okay? I do want to do another segment, but I think we need to come up for air. So let's take a 5-minute break.